Hey there, Fletcher from All Things Overlanding here, and today I wanted to focus on a question that I see a ton in a group that I run called Newbie Overlanders. It's a Facebook group, totally free to join. There will be a link in the description down below, but all the time I get people that come in there that are new to overlanding and they're like, where do I spend my money first? What do I need to buy? Right? And I've kind of talked about this a lot, and my overarching answer to that question is take what you got and get out there and explore, right? But so now let's say you've been on 3 or 4 or 5 trips, you've kind of seen what you need, where the holes in your setup are, and you're trying to prioritize what comes next. I'm going to give you my top 3, and these are my opinions, but I'm going to also tell you why I think these are the top 3 things that you need to focus your spend on first. So if you want to hear more about my top 3 things to pick up after you get into overlanding, stay tuned.
You got it, I got it. It began in the land of the sandstorm. I fought it, though I wanted everything to do with what you give to me. Loosening my grip.
All right, guys, so as I mentioned in the intro today, I'm talking about my top 3 picks for what gear you need to pick up, or what categories of gear you need to pick up once you get started overlanding. Now, again, not to harp on this too much, but I am definitely not one of those people that is like, go out and spend a bunch of money, go buy an expensive $4,000 rooftop tent, go buy a brand new rig, go buy, a decked system for $1,300 for your truck. I'm not going to advocate for that stuff. I do a ton of do-it-yourself stuff, a ton of budget-minded things that I sort of build myself or come up with myself, specifically because I want to save money. And the more that I can stretch my money, the more stuff I can get to make my setup better and more optimized and more comfortable for my overlanding expeditions, if you will. But so let's kind of break this out. I want to give you guys kind of an upfront, here's what the 3 things are going to be. If you're on YouTube and you want to skip around, there will be chapters. If you're on the podcast, of course, just listen through. I'm going to give them to you in chronological order of which I'm going to talk to them. So if you want to skip, you can. Here are my top 3 things that I think you need to get. Once you kind of get into overlanding, you've kind of experienced it a little bit, you do decide that you want to do it and you enjoy it. Here are the things to focus your spending on to get more comfortable and better at overlanding. Thing number 1 is going to be shelter. So that is just kind of one of the things you have to have, right? And when I say focus your spend, I just mean think a lot about your setup, think about what you want to do. Do you want a rooftop tent? If so, what style of rooftop tent? Hard shell, soft shell, whatever. Think about your shelter, think about your needs, think about where you travel to, think about all those things, and then shelter should be a place where you spend some of your budget to make sure that you're going to have a good time when you get out there, right? And again, I'm going to talk through this in more detail here coming up, but I just wanted to break these out into the 3 topics. So shelter is number 1. Number 2 is going to be sleep. And what I mean by that is, again, this ties a little bit into your shelter, but I'm going to get into sort of like mattresses, cots. If you have a rooftop tent, replacing that stock crappy mattress so that you have a good night's sleep. Because one thing is, especially on longer overlanding trips, the worse your sleep, the worse the trip's going to be, the quicker you're going to get tired out, and the less fun you're going to have, right? So sleep is my number 2 sort of topic that I'm going to talk about. And then the third thing that I'm going to talk about is not even necessarily specific to overlanding, but it's clothing. That may sound a little weird, right? You're like, what about recovery? What about first aid and that sort of thing? Of course, those things are definitely something you should consider. And you want to, I'm just taking those out of the equation. Recovery is very important. First aid is very important. Everyone has their own ideas of what that looks like. You may be more experienced in like the medical field than I am. You may have a different set of things that you need for those. Those are just givens, recovery and first aid. I'm just taking out of the equation. These are the things after that I would spend money on. And that third thing is clothing. And again, I'm going to go into more detail on that when we get into section 3 of this podcast / vlog. All right, so first, let's talk about shelter, right? So a lot of this is going to depend on your setup. If you've got a pickup truck and you have a bed rack and you want to put a rooftop tent on there, that's an option. If you are in some sort of a car or a small crossover or something like that, you may need something like a ground tent. If you've been a backpacker before, you may be sort of leaning towards a hammock. I personally have done all these methods. I've been a hammock camper quite a bit. I was a ground sleeper, then I was a tent camper with a cot. Then I moved to a rooftop tent. I had a soft shell rooftop tent. Then I've had a couple of hard shell rooftop tents. So I'm going to kind of touch on hammock, ground tent, rooftop tent. I'm going to just at a high level give you like some examples of what those may look like so that hopefully something will resonate with your setup and help you kind of ideate around, I think that sounds like something I'd want to do. So let's start with hammock. Hammocks to me are great because they are super small, so they take very little space. So again, if you are in a constricted build like a small SUV or a car or something like that, and you don't have a ton of room for a cot, a big tent, a sleeping bag, a pillow, all that stuff that comes with that, then a hammock can save you a ton of space. It's also lightweight, so if you do a lot of backpacking, or if you aren't so vehicle dependent, if you kind of park your car at camp and then you go out and hike, you could have a hammock that you take with you, and that gives you a lot of flexibility in your setup. Then if you are going into sort of the tent realm, there are, truck bed tents. I've never owned one of those, but I've known a few people that have, and they said it's kind of a pain to set up. It's kind of a hassle. Obviously, if you have anything else in the bed of your truck, you're going to have to remove it in order to set up your tent, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt. It makes the bed of your truck less usable, which I think is a downside. But then there are also ground tents. And for ground tents, I like things that are easy to set up and quick to tear down. And so something like a Gazelle T4 would be a good option, or T3. They've got different sizes of these tents. They've got gazebos. They've got all kinds of different things that you can get that are really easy to set up, but the Gazelles are a little bit on the bigger side. So again, if you had a pickup truck with a bed with a lot of space in it, or storage in the back of an SUV, something like a Gazelle could be a good option. Coleman has some really budget-minded pop-up tents. I ran one of those for like 2 years, and it was fine, but they're cheap, so they don't last very long. So you're gonna have to replace them when the zippers go bad, when things start to break down on them. You're gonna have to replace them if you buy a cheaper tent, whereas a Gazelle is a little bit better made and sort of intended for quick setup, quick tear down, and gives you quite a bit of space. Now, if you are like me and you kind of like to be up away from the bugs, up away from the animals and stuff like that, you also like to have really quick setup and really quick tear down and always have the tent with you, I love a rooftop tent. And again, I had a soft shell rooftop tent. It was nice, but it was a pain in the butt to set up. It just took a long time. If you go in the winter, which I do quite a bit, so if you go into colder temps, a soft shell rooftop tent is a lot harder and a lot more work to close down, and when your hands are freezing and you don't have the dexterity with gloves on, it can be quite a hassle to close up a soft shell tent. Now, if you have a hard shell tent, which is what I have gone to over the last 4 years or so probably, it's extremely quick to set up. Maybe a couple latches, you pop it up, it has gas struts, it opens itself up, maybe you put 2 to 4 poles in it for awnings, and you're set. And then when you get done, you pop the poles out, you pull the tent down, you push the fabric in, you clasp the 2 latches or 4 latches, depending on what kind of tent you've got, and you are set and you're ready to go. And that tent is always on there. That's another thing that a lot of people don't talk about is, sure, rooftop tents are expensive. Yes, they're heavy. Yes, the weight's up high. Those are downsides of a rooftop tent, especially a hard shell rooftop tent. My tent weighs 210 pounds. It's very heavy. But I've also been off-roading down in Land Between the Lakes, which is near me in Kentucky, and been in quite a few off-camber situations, 18, 20 degrees. I was even in a 30-degree sideways situation one time, which was not fun, and I did not enjoy it. It was very scary. But even with that weight up there, I never had any problems. It will feel a little sketchy, but you get used to it. It's not necessarily going to flip your truck over every time that you go off camber. But having that quick deployment and having it always on the vehicle, for me anyways, is a big advantage, because a lot of the times I've got a couple kids. If a weekend pops up and my wife is like, we're not doing anything this weekend, if you want to go out camping, go for it, the less stuff I have to pack up, the better. So having it on the vehicle 24/7, just being ready to deploy it, is a bonus. There have also been sporting events and things like that where my kids have had outdoor swim meets and things like that, and it's been a whole day type of thing. And I'm like, if you want to go take a nap, we can go pop up the rooftop tent, we can pop out the awning, we can open up the fridge, we can put drinks in the fridge, right? So having an outfitted rig is kind of a nice thing, and that's why I like rooftop tents. So next, let's move on to sleep. And what I mean about sleep, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's extremely important to the quality of your trips. If you are miserable, if you don't get a good night's sleep, if you sleep 2-3 hours and you wake up, you're tossing and turning the whole time, your mattress isn't comfortable, you don't have a good pillow, you don't have good support for your neck, you wake up with a sore neck, and then you have to drive 6, 7, 8, 10 hours the next day off-roading and trailing, it gets really exhausting, it gets really tiring. If you get stuck, you've got to get out, you've got some physical challenges and stuff to overcome. If you don't get a good night's sleep, then it can definitely impact all the rest of your trip. It can make the whole rest of your trip worse. So having a good sleep setup is very important. Now let's walk through a couple options for that. So again, if you are newer and you're like, well, what does that mean? What do I do, right? Hammock is really easy, because typically with a hammock, you could just do the hammock and then you could throw a sleeping bag in it and a pillow, right? You could get a little bit crazier and you can add like mattresses and stuff to hammocks, and that's kind of nice to give yourself some extra padding and some insulation, especially if you're hammock camping in colder temps. But for the most part, a hammock setup is going to be very lightweight. It's going to have a sleeping bag and some sort of a pillow, and then your hammock, right? If you're a tent camper, again, you could just lay on the ground, and it's going to be hard and it's not going to be very good sleep, so I wouldn't recommend that. I've done that and I don't enjoy it. So then I moved on to like a good partial inflatable / partial memory foam mattress, something like a Luno mattress, is a very nice option. They're very, very comfortable. Those are a good option for like tent camping. If you're going to be laying on the ground, you could just use like a sleep pad and a tent and a sleeping bag and a pillow. Now, if that's not comfortable enough for you, or if you're a little bit older and your back may hurt and stuff like that from laying on the ground, even on some sort of a mattress like that, then that's when a cot comes in handy. But then it's another thing, right? Then you've got your tent, your cot, your sleeping bag, your memory foam / air mattress, and your pillow. So again, we're just increasing the amount of stuff. That's another benefit of the rooftop tent from earlier, is you can keep a lot of your bedding in there oftentimes. So then that reduces the amount of stuff you have to put in the rest of your rig. Just another benefit. But so that's kind of tent stuff. And then with a rooftop tent, again, most of these come with a pretty inexpensive, pretty cheap, kind of crappy mattress in them. So in most cases, I would recommend upgrading your mattress in your rooftop tent. There are some options like Sea to Summit has a really nice double wide inflatable memory foam combo mattress that fits just perfectly, if not a tiny bit too big, in most 7x4 hardshell rooftop tents. And I'll put a link to that in the description down below. Then there's the Luno mattress, which I mentioned, which is a combo inflatable memory foam option, but then you have to bring a pump with you, right? That's the thing with these inflatables, is you have to have a pump to deflate it and inflate it. And that adds a little bit more time to set up and tear down. What I've kind of come to the conclusion of after several years of this is I have a Hest foamy, is what they call it. It's about a 4-inch all memory foam, not inflatable at all mattress. Now, part of the problem is the sizing of these things from Hest. They only go up to 30 inches, and then there's a slightly slimmer one too. Most rooftop tents are some weird amalgamation about 50 inches wide. So unless you can get two 25 inches, which I think theirs are like 27 and 30, so it's just like a 3-inch difference between the mattresses that they've got. Unless you're going solo, which is what I am most of the time, then the Hest may not work if there's 2 of you sleeping in a tent. Now, if you're, again, by yourself, like I am most of the time, my wife does not really enjoy camping all that much, so she doesn't go with me most of the time. I will just throw the Hest in there. I don't have to deflate it or inflate it. It fits in my rooftop tent. I close it up. I'm good to go. I pop it open the next day. I can hop in there, put my pillow in there, and I'm ready to sleep. If my wife goes with me, I'll take the Hest out and I'll put the stock mattress back in. It's not the best, but it is passable, and it will let 2 people get in there. So again, think about how many people are going to be going. Think about your setup, but put some priority behind spending money on your sleep setup and making sure that you're comfortable, that you've got a good pillow. I run a Hest pillow. Luno has a really good pillow too. It's right there with the Hest, maybe a little bit better than the Hest. In my experience, but there are sleep options out there, and it's just not something that occurred to me. I was like, I spent $1,600 on my Nature Nest tent. Why would I go spend more money on a mattress? Unfortunately, the mattresses that come with the stock ones are not very good. And if you do spend that little bit of extra money and you do get that nice mattress, man, I tell you what, I sleep 20 times better now than I did on the stock mattress. So sleep is very important. Spend some money on it. And then finally, let's talk about clothing, right? So again, a little bit unorthodox. Why would I talk about clothing? I mentioned it. I go a lot in the fall and the winter. So for me, clothing is extremely important because it's going to be very cold, and even dangerously so. It may be so cold that I risk hypothermia, or, there are times when it's down at -10, -20 degrees. And if that can impact your sleep, right? If you're freezing to death and shivering and shaking, you're not going to sleep very well. So having good clothing is a nice redundancy. It's a nice backup to your sleep system. It's a nice backup to, say, a diesel heater. It's also important if you are getting in and out of the vehicle to do recoveries, if you're getting stuck and things like that, which can happen quite a bit in overlanding situations and exploration. You can come across a mud pit and get stuck for 2 hours trying to get out of the thing. And if it's really cold outside and you're wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and maybe you have like a fleece to throw on, you're probably going to be cold. Your hands are going to lose dexterity, or you're going to not have a good time, right? So having the right clothes, having waterproof boots if you plan to, or you anticipate hitting mud or water crossings, that sort of thing. Good example, I was down in Land Between the Lakes about a week or so ago, and I stepped in a mud puddle in my plain shoes, and I didn't have an extra set. So I soaked up to about my mid-calf. My pants were soaked from my mid-calf down, my socks were soaked on my left foot, and my shoe was completely soaked for the remainder of the day. So bring backups, bring some redundancy. Again, if you anticipate possibly being in muddy or wet situations, bring waterproof jackets. If it's going to rain, be ready for the rain. Just think about your clothing. And again, don't don't just plan to go out there in jeans and a t-shirt if it's going to be cold. Don't just plan to go out there with a fleece on if it's going to rain, because your fleece is going to get soaked and then you're going to be freezing and you're not going to be able to get warm and you're not going to be able to dry that fleece. So again, you have to think about your clothes. You have to put some forethought into it, and that's a good place to buy better quality stuff that's not going to, let you down out on a trip, or that's not going to fall apart after 1 or 2 uses. So again, that was my list of 3 sort of ideas of categories for things where I think early overlanders should spend their budget if they're looking to get into overlanding and they've done a few trips and they've gotten a little bit of experience. Those are what I would recommend looking at first. I hope that was helpful for you. If it was and you're on YouTube, click that like button. If you're on the podcast, favorite the podcast, leave a 5-star review. That helps a ton, shows other people it's a good podcast, and I appreciate it. Down in the description below, as I mentioned, will be links to all the things that I talked about in this video. So if you want to look at any of those more, check those links out down below. There's also links to all my social channels. So wherever you want to come hang out, I'd love to have you. And as I mentioned, the Newbie Overlanders group is also linked down there, and we'd love to have you. It's totally free. Come hang out there. Below this video on YouTube is a join button. If you click that, it's a way to passively support the channel, and it also gives you early access to videos and some other perks. There's also a link to my Patreon group where it's a little more active way to engage with all things overlanding. So if you want to be involved in that, we have a 24/7 Discord, we have a once-a-month Zoom call, and we do a couple trips every year, so tons of fun. Then, of course, there's a link to my website where I've got funny overlanding camping themed patches and stickers. So things like don't burn your wiener and it's a hot dog, or I hate people so I camp, that kind of thing. So check those out if you're interested in getting some patches and stickers. And then that will do it for this episode of the podcast. So again, I hope that was helpful for you. I appreciate you guys watching and listening, and we'll see you next week.